I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, we have got the list of demands, the list of negotiation topics. Maybe demands may be a strong word, via Michel Barnier of the EU that he's given to Boris Johnson of the UK. And you've taken a look at what the EU is hoping to discuss and hoping to get out of Brexit as they negotiate the trade agreement. What is your take on what Barnier is asking for?
Well, it seems to me that Monsieur Barnier and the other European officials have clearly learnt nothing at all from the previous negotiations. Let's take a step back and go back just very quickly over what happened last year during the detailed negotiations that eventually resulted in Brexit. As we know, they pushed very hard Theresa May to agree all kinds of proposals that would have basically kept Britain in the customs union and the European single market indefinitely, with the European Union having a veto power on Britain ever leaving it as a condition for the EU agreeing to Brexit. And what that achieved was that, of course, it completely obliterated in the end. It crushed Theresa May's credibility. It led to losing her position as Prime Minister. It brought in Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson would have none of this. And though he was negotiating from what seemed to be a weak position, in the sense that he only had a small majority in the House of Commons, he didn't have a majority in the House of Commons. Eventually, the result was that he tore up Theresa May's agreement, came back with a very much harder Brexit, which he negotiated over Michel Barnier's head with the European leaders, with Macron, France, and Vadeker of Ireland. And that, of course, meant that Britain ceased to be part of the European Union, a single market and customs union, and is not subject to any sort of European veto via some weird and wonderful proposal via the Irish border that would keep it there indefinitely. So Barnier overstepped, he overplayed his hand. He imagined that the Europeans were in a much stronger position vis-a-vis the British than they really were. And he discovered that, in fact, the British, in the form of the British government, in the form of Boris Johnson, were simply not prepared to go along with it. And that any British Prime Minister who did go along with it, as Theresa May did, would see their position disintegrate. Now, he is trying to do the same thing all over again. He is in effect telling Boris Johnson that what the British refused to accept in the run-up to Brexit, they must now accept after Brexit. They must accept the greatest possible harmonization of their economy with the Europeans, pretty much, as far as I can understand, indefinitely, with all sorts of other concessions being made by the British to the Europeans. In other words, again, what Barnier is talking about, if you drill through the proposals carefully, is he wants Britain to remain essentially an EU satellite. And of course, what that has done is that it has provoked Boris Johnson into making a very strong speech in which he said absolutely no way. And Boris Johnson has said that there must be a deal this year, and that deal must mean that Britain must have the right to go its own way, and that the only thing the British are interested in is a free trade agreement. And if they don't get a free trade agreement, it will be WTO terms. In other words, the kind of no-deal Brexit that people were talking about before. So what Barnier is doing is he is increasing again the prospects of a no-deal Brexit, what is called a no-deal Brexit, a WTO Brexit, if you like, by taking an impossibly hard line and pursuing an impossibly over-ambitious negotiation strategy. Here's my prediction. I think when the Germans, in particular, get wind of what he is doing, they won't let him do it. And as we move forward with the negotiations, you will see that the Germans will step in and will tell Barnier, look, this isn't practical. You're going to put our economy in a very difficult position if you do that. That, you know, this attempt to subjugate, if you like, the British by other means isn't going to work. The British clearly mean what they're talking about, and we will see a deal done, and it will be much more like a free trade agreement. This is my view.
Okay, so Boris Johnson has learned, it seems, from Theresa May's blunders and mistakes. The Germans appear to have learned from the previous negotiations of the EU's mistakes, so they want a deal.
Yeah.
Barnier seems to not have learned from the negotiations. Who's pushing Barnier to take this line?
Well, I think, first of all, the European Commission, the European officials in Brussels. And you say the Germans. I mean, you must understand, Germany is obviously a very big country. There are many people with different views in Germany. What I said was that eventually, when the Germans understand what direction Barnier is taking, then the penny will drop, and we will see in a few months' time what is happening. But we have to address the fact that within the EU, there is always a very powerful, very dominant group who believe in integration, centralization, federalization. They haven't gone away. They haven't given up. And in fact, the fact that Britain seems to be slipping away from them, in fact, is slipping away from them, is making them even more determined to assert themselves. I said that eventually pragmatic reasons will make the Germans step in and rein him in. But at the moment, I suspect he expresses what is still the dominant EU consensus, and that he has supporters in both the French and German governments.
Yeah, but the problem I see with all of this, Alexander, is that the timeline, the window, is very narrow.
Very narrow.
So if the EU and the Germans are going to tell Barnier and the Brussels elite, you know, look, we need to rethink how we're going to negotiate and not go down the same path we went with May, they're going to have to do it fairly quickly, because at the end of the day, you are going to need time to actually negotiate and hammer out some type of deal. So the window's very, very narrow here. So people are going to have to wake up very quickly.
Indeed, sir. And of course, this is going to be a very complicated and difficult negotiation. It's not going to be the kind of negotiation which Boris Johnson was able to make a quick deal with Macron in New York and with Vodka and simply ran through, because that was a negotiation about principles. This is going to be a long-term free trade or some other kind of agreement establishing Britain's relationship with the EU for the very long, perhaps indefinite term. So it's going to be a very tough negotiation to work out. It's going to require a huge amount of work on the detail. And I think what you're going to see over the next few weeks is, I think the British, which is to say Boris Johnson and his ministers, for whom, to be very clear, this must be a priority now. They will be banging doors across Europe, in Berlin, in Paris, wherever. And they will be saying, look, what Barnier is doing is simply not going to work. You've got to move very quickly, or you will end up with precisely the kind of WTO hard Brexit, no deal Brexit, that you were also frightened of in the months leading up to the British general election and the deal that we eventually did. And that if you don't do that, if you don't agree to move, the British government with a secure majority in the House of Commons is not only not going to buckle, it's going to start working on alternative possibilities. It's going to start taking all the steps it needs to take to make sure that if there is a no-deal Brexit at the end of December, then Britain will be able to coast through it with a minimum of disruption. But that this is not a bluff.
Okay, so it seems that Boris is taking a strong, firm position.
Yeah.
That's understood. Is it me, Alexander?
To the shock, I should say, of many people within the British establishment. There have already been some very, very interesting articles.
I was just about to get to that.
Yeah,
Good
yeah,
on Boris Johnson for taking a firm
yeah,
position. You need
yeah,
to have a firm position when you're
yeah.
negotiating. Is it me, or am I seeing a lot of articles, a lot of news anchors, TV segments in the British media going after Boris Johnson?
Absolutely. I mean, and this
That's the impression that I'm getting by reading through the British media and seeing the videos and the news segments.
That's indeed exactly right, and that's exactly what you're going to see. I mean, there was, in particular, a fascinating article in the Financial Times, which is, of course, the voice of the pro-European British business establishment. Not all British business is pro-EU, but a lot of it is, and they find their voice in the Financial Times, and it's talking about how Boris Johnson is going to shoot Britain in both feet by taking the hard line that he supposedly is. So there is that element within the British establishment, which was expecting, by the way, which had persuaded themselves that after the election, Boris Johnson would tilt towards a more pro-EU or more accommodative position. And now they are shocked to discover that he's no intention of doing so, and are becoming alarmed. And of course, also, I'm seeing there was a very interesting article by a man called Raphael Burr in The Guardian, which is essentially a call to Conservative MPs to do to Boris Johnson what some of them did to Theresa May, which is to rebel against him and to try to undermine his negotiating position. I don't think that's going to happen, by the way. I think Conservative MPs saw what happened to those who undermined Theresa May's and Boris Johnson's negotiating position before the election. They all lost their seats. They're all driven out of their party and lost their seats. And I don't think you're going to see anything like that happening this time. But the pressures are obviously there.
Final question: why would the media and some business establishments want to undermine the UK's positions in these negotiations? It's over now. I could see the Theresa May part where it was very controversial because the UK was still part of the EU, but now it's over. The UK's out. So now it's just about what's best for the country. What can they get out of this that benefits the country most? Why would they want to go against their own country?
Well,
doesn't make any sense.
I think you have to remember something about business and the business community now in all countries, which is, of course, most, they're all, no doubt, in their own self-definition, patriotic people. But a lot of business now has become very globalized. A lot of business has become very integrated with the EU. I'm talking about especially, the financial community and people like that. And of course, from their point of view, they want Britain to remain as closely integrated with the EU as possible. You have an awful lot of other people in the business world who don't think of that way, particularly people who run small and medium-sized businesses up and down the country who don't trade much with the EU. For them, that isn't an issue in the same way. And of course, there are also people within the financial community, which is very big in England, who, again, think in a more, shall we say, global way. They're not so European focused. But you will find some people within the business community in Britain who do think in a very Europeanist way and who've had 47 years of Britain in the EU and who are basically conditioned or hardwired to think so. And for them, it's also an ideological thing. I mean, they're part of the Davos world, the people who meet every year at the famous Swiss mountain resort in Davos and share its nostrums and orthodoxies. And for them, it's still a shock that Britain, which used to be a pillar of that orthodoxy, is breaking away. So it's not really at all surprising that there's a pushback from these forces. All I would say is, though that pushback is there, it is nowhere near as strong as it was, say, a year ago. I mean, the events of the last year have weakened them greatly. And though they are making these noises and obviously making these complaints, hoping against hope that there will be a conservative rebellion within the parliamentary majority. I think deep down, even they realise that the game is up. So they will make their noises for the time being. I don't think it's going to amount to anything. The risk is, the danger is, that people like Barnier may think it will. But if they think that, they will be disappointed.
All right, Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much, guys. If you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on that notifications bell and hit that like button. And also donate to us on PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Your donation really helps out this channel a whole lot. And something else that helps out this channel a whole lot is when you go to the Duran shop and pick up some magic mugs or magic shirts, which will always help you when you're negotiating certain events in your life.
Absolutely, Sarah. I mean, this is my magic mug at the moment. It's my oldest one. It's my very first one because, as you can see, it's got the double-headed eagle of the Duran itself, which is different, say, from the Russian double-headed eagle. It's more like the East Roman one, the Roman Empire's one, the Roman Empire of Constantine the Great and Justinian and those people. And you can also see it on our shirts. Many of our shirts carry it too. And just to remind people, it is the Duran's double-headed eagle because it hovers over the world and looks simultaneously like the two heads of the double-headed eagle do towards the east and the west. So it covers the entire world. Now, this is my oldest mug. I drink from it every day. As you can see, it is in perfect condition. It is strong and light and elegant to hold and to, to carry. It keeps your tea, as I drink tea mainly, it keeps your tea hot. It keeps your coffee hot. It keeps your beer cold. It is a beautiful mug. We made a decision right at the beginning when we decided to open a shop and sell merchandise to go it for very high-end, very high-quality products. And this mug, you can see how good it is, not a chip or a crack or a sign of discoloration in it. So all our mugs are of the same quality. They are really beautiful. They are really strong. They are very hard wearing. They are absolutely top-notch quality. And the same, of course, is true of our shirts. The long-sleeved T-shirt I'm wearing now because it's a cold February day in London. But we've also got short-sleeved T-shirts. We've got polo shirts, really smart, elegant polo shirts. We've got V-neck shirts. All our shirts are 100% cotton. They are extremely hard wearing. They're very stylish. I've been wearing this shirt so much. And again, it's in perfect condition. It is as good as new. You will find that it's not just our shirts that are of the same quality in our shop. We also sell hoodies, hats, stickers, other great things. And if you come to our shop and buy these wonderful things and become their proud owner, you are also helping the Duran too. We have to rely on the support of our viewers to keep the Duran going and to provide you with the kind of analysis that we do. And one of the ways you can show that support is by coming to our shop. So come to our shop, buy these great things, support the Duran, own these things for yourself. Alex will tell you how.
Go to theduranshop.com. You'll find the link in the description box down below. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Until next time, everybody, take care.